Hey everyone, my name is James, and I'm back on my self-defense beanie. The reviews were in and the scores were counted. Final Fantasy Legends 1 was a hit. It sold a whopping 1,000,000.37 copies worldwide. Square was eager to get back to work on another Game Boy JRPG. However, they decided instead of spinning off into a separate series or, like the sister series Final Fantasy, moving on to new mechanics, they wanted Final Fantasy Legends 2 to be more of a refinement of mechanics explored in the first one. There was a bit of a rough development cycle. Square moved HQs in the middle of the creation, as well as many of the other team members being pulled off of the project to work on Final Fantasy III, which they expected to be a much bigger success. However, after those delays were cleared, production began in earnest and they quickly sped through, since they were reusing a lot of art assets and refining game systems instead of starting from scratch. Nobu Uematsu returned to compose the music for this title, as well as getting help from Kenji Ito, who would be taking his first job in composition for Squaresoft. After this, he would go on to compose many other soundtracks for the SaGa series. More recently, a complete remake was released for the Nintendo DS that incorporated a lot of elements of later SaGa games, such as LP and sparking techniques. This game is almost completely different, or at least different enough that I think it warrants its own separate video if I ever decide to go and take a look at that. That being said, let's get into SaGa 2, Hayo Densetsu, or Final Fantasy Legends 2. As previously mentioned, because Final Fantasy Legends 2 is a more of an iteration on previous mechanics, we're going to speed through this generalities section pretty quickly. As with many JRPGs, Final Fantasy Legends uses the typical JRPG battle system, taking turns fighting enemies. Once again, stat growth is determined by the weapons that you equip and how you use your abilities, also partially determined by race, which we will get into in more detail later. The big difference here is that humans no longer use items to level up their stats, but gain stats in the same way that mutants did in the previous game. Weapon scaling returns again. In a similar manner, agility and strength are the main basis of weapon stat scales, although some weapons still scale with mana as well. Weapon durability is back as well, although there are a couple of twists on that with a racial mechanic from the robots. By and large, however, every weapon has a certain amount of uses, and once it's exhausted, it will go away and needs to be repurchased to be used again. Heart points, as mentioned in the previous game, now are gone from the game completely, and your characters revive automatically at the end of battles and can be revived during battle through the use of items or magic. Also new to the series, taking a leaf out of Final Fantasy II's book once again, guest characters will join the party throughout the game. These are characters that are usually stronger than the other party members that will hang around and help you until the plot dictates that they leave. Their equipments and items are locked to the characters so they can't be modified at all, but they can be given extra weapons in the case of them having exhausted the ones that they have. Also new to the series is a free revive mechanic, where if your party gets wiped out, you will be sent to visit Odin in Valhalla. He will offer to revive you for free, in return for which you must fight him eventually when you progress the story to this point. If you choose to, then you will be taken back to the beginning of the fight and allowed to try it again, instead of just dumped into a game over screen, as is typical for JRPGs. The biggest change this time around is the addition of the Magi System, which is essentially like a extra accessory slot
As you gather more Magi throughout the game, they will be equipable, and they will either augment stats, augment elemental abilities, status effect abilities, or add extra attacks that have limited uses during battle. Each character can only have one equipped at a time, and you gather more and more at varying levels as you progress through the game. One of the most innovative and honestly best systems that appears in this game is the Memo System, which essentially actually also functions very similar to Final Fantasy II in that every time the game records you having a significant dialogue conversation or you talk about something important with another NPC, it will keep record of that under specific headings. You can always come back to those and look at them, so you don't have to keep notes while you're playing the game. This is an incredibly cool feature, and the only time I've seen systems like it is, as I mentioned, in Final Fantasy II with the keyword system, or if I recall correctly, some of the Tales of games have a story, like a running story log that they keep that you can refer back to. Humans this time around return again as our all-rounder class. They have higher starting stats, although specifically lower starting mana. As previously mentioned, they will gain more stats dependent on the type of weapon that they're using. Specifically, male humans start out with more strength and less agility, and female humans start with more agility and less strength. Mutants function very similar too, except here their stat growths are less than humans, except for in mana, which they get much higher growths in. They again have a rotating selection of 4 abilities that will appear randomly on completion of battle, only this time they will cycle out with the most recent ability gained being the one replaced. And since you can go into your inventory and reorganize how your abilities are laid out, you can make sure that you don't lose more important abilities or ones that you use more often. Using both spellbooks as well as mutant special abilities will increase the mana stat, not just using mana scaling weapons. New to the series as a playable race, we get robots, who function fairly differently than pretty much all the other classes. Instead of getting stat growths at the end of battles like mutants or humans do, robots have static base stats and will get more or less stat points based on what they have equipped to them. Each piece of equipment has a designated stat that it increases by a designated amount. Generally, these will correspond to what their scaling is, so a strength scaling weapon will increase a robot's strength, whereas an agility will increase their agility. All defensive items increase defense, and in fact, robots are the only race that can equip multiple copies of the same type of armor. So, if you find 4 helmets that happen to be better defensive than, say, a whole set of bronze armor, you can just slap all the helmets on them, and it works just fine. Where this starts to get interesting is how robots interact with durability. See, when you equip a weapon, it halves its usable durability. However, when you use up a weapon, it doesn't deplete it and remove it from your inventory. And in fact, sleeping in an inn will recover that weapon's usages, kind of like monster abilities or mutant abilities. Robots don't ever have a mana stat, and can't ever increase their mana. As a result, they can't use spellbooks effectively, and also are resistant to magic, including cure spells. Similarly, as being a robot, they come innately with immunity to poison and paralysis. And finally, returning again is monsters, which function fairly similarly to how they do in previous games. As previously, they can't use any sort of equipment, weapons, armor, or accessories, although they can equip Magi, obviously. They come with a set amount of abilities, attacks, and passive abilities or weaknesses. Usually these are determined by what class of monster they are. Weaker ones will have less, and stronger ones will have more. The only way to become stronger is by eating a monster's meat of a higher tier level. Generally speaking, this will happen when you enter a new zone, or if you get a chance to eat boss meat. And similarly to the previous game, if your monster runs out of uses of their ability, either eating meat to change them into a new monster, or resting at the inn will recover those uses. The game starts out pretty similarly to how the first one did. You pick your character, be it human, mutant, robot, or monster type, and then get dropped into the first scene. Your deadbeat dad is getting the heck out of there, but before he leaves, he wants you to have a Magi, called Radar. Some time passes, and you finally get the nerve up to tell your mom that you want to go look for Dad. She's not too happy about it, but she can tell that your mind can't be changed. Later that day at school, your teacher, Mr. S, tells you that if you're going to go out and have adventures, you should probably take a party along with you, so your classmates all come along. You are then given the opportunity to pick 3 other characters to add to your party, and these will be constant throughout the game. Unlike the first game, this one doesn't really have a guild system, because it also doesn't really have permadeath. And while this is good, because permadeath kinda sucks, it also makes the game a little bit more difficult because your party choices are final, and you really can screw yourself over with a suboptimal party. On your way out of the village, Mr. S stops you and says, well, maybe it's a better idea not to let a bunch of random school kids run around in a dangerous fantasy land, so he accompanies you through the first dungeon. Mr. S is pretty powerful, and he'll basically just melt enemies for you. Unfortunately, he only stays with you through the first dungeon. I guess it's good enough to help you get to the first town, but after that, he's gotta go. In the first town, you find a man that looks suspiciously like your dad, but apparently isn't, who for some reason just tells you that if you wanted to find some Magi, you gotta look for some ruins of the old gods. Asking around the town and talking to the villagers reveals that there is a temple dedicated to Isis to the west. We know that Isis is one of the original, if not the original god, so off we go. At the Temple of Isis, we meet the healer Key, who asks us why we're looking for Magi. We tell them that our main character is looking for their dad, who has apparently already been here, referred to as the guy with the hat on, and Key relents and tells you, in the most cryptic way possible, that there are some ruins to the old gods somewhere near a cactus. After fighting our way through the ruins of the old gods, we see some suspicious fellows just ahead of us who are opening chests and looting what I can only imagine are supposed to be Magi. Catching up to them, though, we find their dead bodies, and they reveal that they are capital G guardians and that they were only trying to protect the Magi from Ashura's cronies who are gathering Magi so Ashura can be more powerful. Checking in with Key back at the temple, she will tell you that Ashura's base is to the north, and since he's been a growing threat in the world, she'll come along to help you take him out. Fighting through Ashura's base, we find that, in fact, he's left completely and gone to another world, and left behind an enemy who is called a rhino, but is decidedly a Triceratops. After killing him, we can loot some Magi from the chest behind him, and Ashura's secret base will collapse. We find a strange column that acts as a interdimensional portal between the different worlds. Key will stay behind, however, because she knows you're strong enough, and also this world still needs protection. In Ashura's world, we can talk to some of the townspeople around, and find out that his base is again hidden, but this time in a bunch of clouds or something, instead of being in the desert. Halfway through Ashura's tower, we come across a jail cell with another guy who suspiciously looks like your dad, but he isn't. Free him from jail and he'll be our next NPC partner, accompanying you to the top of the tower to also help you kill Ashura. Before you can fight him though, Ashura reveals that his henchmen have already gotten to Ki, shrinking themselves down and entering her body. See, apparently the reason that Ki has the ability of healing is because for some reason there is actual pieces of Magi inside her body. We get really upset and kill Ashura, Mask leaves, and we rush off to check on Ki. When we return to Ki, there's a sprite sitting next to her that tells us the only way to save her is to learn the power of micronization, which is apparently a secret known to the giants in the next world. Also, oddly, as if it was an afterthought, she remembers that somebody came by and gave her a piece of Magi to give to us. So off we go to the giants' world. In the giant world, we finally catch up with our dad, but instead of going home with us, he tells us that there are more Magi out there and they need to be protected. Ashura was not the only one trying to be God. We also run into an NPC named Johnny, who apparently used to be a giant, but he micronized himself to be a normal-sized human. He tells you the way to get into the old giant's village, and we go off to get micronization. When we get back to Ki, we can micronize and head into her body, where we find that there are viruses attacking the Magi inside her, which is making her sick. With every virus defeated and the Magi all removed, our task is done. In the next world, we meet the ruler Apollo, who is apparently a kind, benevolent god who definitely doesn't want to do anything sinister. This is punctuated by the fact that all the NPCs tell you that he's nice, he tells you that he's nice, and he also has an ungodly big sprite compared to everybody else. Nothing suspicious here. If you stop by to check in on him after you gather the Magi in the world, you'll see that he's mysteriously disappeared, even though nobody in the town seems to note it. The next world seems to be the home base of the Guardians who we've run into previously. These are the guys that are devoted to protecting Magi from falling into the wrong hands. After doing some asking around town and poking around in the local bar, we find that their hideout is disguised as a jukebox and immediately get ambushed by Guardians. We wake up confused in a jail cell, but before we can get any answers, who should show up but our dad, who, surprise, is being called Captain by everyone. Apparently he's been the captain of the Guardians the whole time. But before he can do any exposition or plot dump, monsters come in to attack the secret base. After fighting our way out of the Guardian base, we head to the next world and find a young girl named Lynn, who we'd met earlier in the game, being menaced by a samurai. Dad jumps in to save her, and we take Lynn back to her mom, assuming that Dad sacrifices himself for her sake. If you talk to the mom, she'll reveal a weird kind of plot beat where her husband and your father were like best friends in the Guardians, but after he died, your dad stepped in to take care of her and her daughter. So he's got kind of like a family on the side kind of thing going on. Speeding through the next couple of worlds because they don't really have any overarching plot significance, you find a sci-fi futuristic world sort of contrasts with a underdeveloped world where everybody in the sci-fi town is beautiful and there's a Romeo and Juliet thing going on. There's a feudal Japanese level where the central conflict concerns warring houses and the smuggling of bananas. There's a weird world that apparently is dedicated to a racetrack where Apollo is hanging out officiating races for some reason instead of taking care of his world. And finally, there's Odin's world, where you just basically fight him, grab some Magi, and move on. Finally, we catch up to Apollo, who has apparently continued to move through the worlds, and he gets his opportunity to take his villain turn. See, he wasn't really benevolent and nice this whole time, he was just trying to gather up Magi, like everybody else, so he could summon Isis and become all-powerful. You're about to take him down, but it turns out that he's captured all the NPCs that you've made friends with from the other worlds, and he threatens to kill them. Obviously, since you're the do-good hero party, you can't let that happen, and he runs away, after taking all of your Magi. Just at our lowest point, though, Dad shows up out of nowhere, because apparently he's not actually dead after all, and he gives us the whole story. See, apparently there were actually 78 pieces of Magi, not 77, as people previously thought. The Guardians had spread the rumor of the 77 pieces because they wanted to keep the last piece safe. And wouldn't you know it, the final place that has the last piece of Magi is a world called the final dungeon. So after fighting our way through the final dungeon and taking out a boss on loan from the Final Fantasy collection, we get the final piece of Magi and can head after Apollo. Catching up with Apollo at the center of the world, we warn him that if he uses the 77 pieces, he is missing one and it's going to mess him up. He doesn't care though, and we fight him. During the battle, he tries to self-destruct on you, but luckily Dad saves you in time, sacrificing himself. For good. Maybe. Now that we have all of the pieces of Magi, though, we summon Isis, who pops in to tell you that Apollo really messed some shit up and the world's gonna fall apart. She promises that she'll bring your dad back to life, but first there's something we've got to take care of. She shrinks down to a normal person size and becomes your last NPC guest character. You fight your way through monsters to get down to the core of the world, which is apparently some sort of supercomputer run by two giant robot machines. Isis takes on one, and your party takes on the other. After successfully defeating them, you tell Isis that you'll see her again soon, but she informs you that she has to stay behind, reboot the computer, and save the world's core. But maybe your ancestors will see her somewhere down along the line, when people call upon the Magi again to bring her back. Meeting back up with Dad, we head home. Finally, we get a cute little post-credits scene that mirrors the beginning of the game, where your dad is like, okay, I'm gonna leave through this window, and you're like, wait, but I'm coming too. And then your mom busts in, and she's like, you guys are stupid, I'm also coming with you. And we're done.
I actually enjoyed my time a lot with this game, and it was surprisingly more playable than its predecessor. One of the major improvements in this game from the first one is there's a much less clear-cut choice between good and bad characters, although there are ways to still mess up your starting party. In the previous game, we found that mutants overall were better than humans in pretty much every category, and monsters across the board were pretty useless, at least in my experience. In this playthrough, my party consisted of one human, one mutant, one robot, and one monster, and all of those characters seemed to function pretty well within the party, except for, once again, the monster, which I was never able to use correctly or utilize in a way that made them a big contributor to the party's balance. I think I would have been better off either replacing that with a mutant or another robot. Following on that theme, going back to the Game Boy was hard because the previous game we had played on the WonderSwan Color port, and that game had a little bit more information baked into them. Since we are on the Game Boy this time around for Final Fantasy Legends 2, however, that information is almost completely gone. Menus and all of the in-game stuff tells you very little about what is going on. This is down to weapon, item, and magic descriptions. Although most of it is pretty self-explanatory, you would never know for sure weapons, scaling stats, how much more powerful they are than other weapons, and what's more effective. And following on this, monster transformation is treated the same way, where every time it's basically a crap shot whether you're going to get a better monster or not. I suppose you could keep a chart of what monsters turn into other monsters from eating certain monster meat. That seems like way much more work than it's worth. To be fair, I understand that it's fairly common with these older games especially because things like cartridge size was so limited, especially on the Game Boy, for a lot of that information to be loaded into game manuals instead of being present in the game itself. And in this case, the manual seems fairly accurate and well descriptive. I also found some scans of reference cards that I assume must have been pack-ins with the game on Moby games that have charts of what weapon scales are. However, the unfortunate thing is, if you were playing a used copy, like I'm pretty sure my childhood copy was, you don't have access to any of that. And before the internet was a thing, you certainly didn't have access to any of that. I think my big problem with this game, and realizing again that this is unavoidable considering the format, is that its complexity does not really serve the gameplay much, although it is impressive for the time. If the idea was to make a small and concise Game Boy RPG experience that is based around mobility, one of the things they talked about previously in the last episode is that they wanted to design it around being able to play it successfully in short bursts of time, whether you're taking the bus or riding in a taxi cab, you could still feel like you're making progress, which is good. However, if the game requires excessive amounts of reference material, then that cuts down on its portability, right? So, sure, you could walk around and fight some battles, maybe get some gold, transform your monster, do stuff like that, level up, but if you come to a town and you need to figure out if a weapon is better than another weapon, then you're completely out of luck unless you're lugging around the reference cards with you. On the other side, however, since it is designed with a high encounter rate, so you're getting those encounters even when you're playing in short bursts, if you are playing it in a sit-down situation like I did, then it becomes incredibly tedious to fight through those random encounters because you're hitting them so often. However, being in a sit-down situation is much more conducive to reading and utilizing those resource materials. Limited inventory space works slightly better here, specifically because they've increased the inventory space across the board from what it used to be from the first game, as well as giving you a fairly generous party inventory. Items still have to be equipped to individual characters to use them, which I think is frustrating, but I very rarely found myself having to juggle around individual party inventories to make sure that I could equip all the weapons I wanted to equip or equip all the armor that I needed to equip. Finally, I appreciate how this game takes the narrative structure approach of the first one and splits it up even more. One of the things that we talked about in the first game is that it takes sort of a short story format, spreading those short stories across the 4 different levels of the tower, and that ultimately culminating in getting to the top and fighting God. This game takes that and splits it up much more, making those short stories more intertwined with the long-term running plot of the game, weaving that throughout each, and then finally culminating in your battle with Apollo. I think this works really well, especially in a game where you can't necessarily tell a big complicated narrative because of cartridge size and text box size being so limited. Having it concise and pared down to hitting these short story beats as you move through the game continues to be a really good idea, and is actually interestingly reflected in the rest of the series as it will go on. One of the things that I know is most notable about the SaGa series, especially like romancing SaGa games, is that they're known for this sort of non-linear short story kind of format, and it's really interesting to see that have its genesis in the beginning of the game. Overall, I would say though, how this feels to play, it pretty much obviates the existence of the first game. When we get into the third one, that is both more complex and more like a traditional JRPG, so I think that one definitely stands on its own in contrast. But I don't think there's really much of a point to play the first Final Fantasy Legend when 2 exists. That being said, Though I had fun with this game, it does require a lot of keeping windows open so you can reference Wikipedia pages, or for some reason, if you have an original copy in the box, referencing those reference materials that I brought up, which is not my favorite way to play a game. I don't mind it, but it's not preferable. Obviously, like we talked with the last one, you can get this one on the Game Boy. A collection of SaGa for the Switch just recently came out. Those seem like they're pretty serviceable ports. Those would be the easiest way to play them. I don't really know anything about the DS port at this point. Maybe I'll be looking into that sometime in the future. Thanks as always, guys, for joining me. I like doing these sort of long format videos, even if they take a long time to record and edit. I hope you found this enjoyable and informative. I'm kind of looking at these as like videos as a service, so that's why I usually go a little bit more in depth in the story breakdown, because while I think these games are cool and interesting, they're not necessarily a game that I would recommend playing. If you enjoy these, please leave a thumbs up, leave a comment, let me know what's up. I think I'll be taking a break from the SaGa series for a second to do some other games, and then maybe I'll come back to Legends 3 at some point. But thanks for watching, and I will see you around in the next one.